A pleasant good morning all, and welcome to the officials of the Ministry of Finance and the Office of the Procurement Regulation. My name is Devendranath Tanku, and I'm the chairman of the Public Accounts Committee. The Public Accounts Committee, the PAC, has a mandate to consider and report to the House on A, appropriation accounts of monies expended out of sums granted by Parliament to meet the public expenditure of Trinidad and Tobago. B, such other accounts as may be referred to the committee by the House of Representatives or as are authorized or required to be considered by the committee under any other enactment. C, the report of the Auditor General on any such accounts. And D, whether policy is carried out efficiently, effectively, and economically, and whether expenditure conforms to the authority which governs it. The purpose of this meeting is for the Public Accounts Committee to conduct an examination of the audited financial statements of the Office of Procurement Regulation for the financial years 2018 to 2020 to assess whether expenditure conforms to the authority which governs it, to hear the challenges being faced by the key stakeholders in an attempt to determine some of the possible solutions to these challenges, and to assist the Office of Procurement Regulation in achieving the efficient delivery of services while fulfilling its mandate in an efficient, effective, and economic manner. Based on the issues identified by your committee, the following key stakeholders have been invited to today's session: the Ministry of Finance and the Office of Procurement Regulation. Please note that this virtual meeting is being broadcast live on Parliament's Channel 11, on Radio 105.5 FM, and on Parliament's YouTube channel, ParlView. As always, participants are advised to have your microphones on mute until recognized by the chair, and you can use your hand symbols on your program on Zoom to advise if you are interested in commenting or raising issues or clarifications as we move forward. I want to invite members of the Public Accounts Committee to introduce themselves to the panel here today. May I begin with Ms. John?
Sorry, Chairman. Good morning, members. Welcome to the committee meeting. Sorry that I sound so rushed. It's just I'm trying to get everything done. Thank you, Chairman. You look very nice. I might say so.
Thank you very much. Dr. Brown?
Good morning to those appearing before this committee today. My name is Emery Brown. I'm the Minister of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs and committee member.
Ms. Sipasad?
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Shuri Sipasad. I am a member of the Public Accounts Committee, and I welcome everybody who is attending. Thanks.
Mr. Lyons?
Good morning and Happy New Year to everyone. My name is Adrian Lyons. I'm a committee member.
Mr. Monroe?
Hi, good morning, Chairman. Good morning, all. Welcome to all this morning. Roger Monroe, committee member.
Can I ask members of the Ministry of Finance to introduce ourselves as well, beginning with the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Finance?
Good morning, Chairman, members of the committee, members of the viewing audience. My name is Michelle Durham-Kisoon, Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Finance.
Good morning, Chairman, members of the committee, and all present in the meeting this morning. I am Yvonne Nimacharan, Acting Deputy Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Finance. Thank you.
Good morning, Chairman, members of the committee, members of the viewing public. My name is Jonathan Suhon, Senior State Counsel in the Ministry of Finance.
Thank you all from the Ministry of Finance. I would like to have members of the Office of Procurement Regulation introduce themselves, beginning with the chairman.
Thank you very much, Chairman. My name is Monilal Lalchan, Procurement Regulator and Chairman of the Board.
Good morning, Chairman. My name is Robbie Bowler, Deputy Chairman of the OPR.
Good morning, Chair, members of the committee. I am Neely Michelle, member of the Procurement Board.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nadira Mohammed. I'm Head of Finance.
Good morning, everyone. I am Kimberly St. Bernard, Head HR and Administration.
Good morning, Chairman and members. I am Lindy Ann Mitchell, Head Legal.
Good morning, Chair, members of the committee. I am Dalreen Liverpool, Corporate Secretary.
And good morning, Chair and members. I am Tracy Rojas, one of the members of the board.
Thank you all members for attending today's session. I want to then move on to asking the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Finance to make a brief opening statement. Mrs. Michelle Dunham-Kissoon, the floor is yours.
Thank you for inviting me to make an opening statement, Chairman. The Office of Procurement Regulation holds significant authority and power under the parent legislation, Act No. 1 of 2015, as defined in Section 13(1), which sets out the functions of the office, Section 13(2)(b), and Section 14(1). Of the three sections referenced here, the Ministry of Finance as the line ministry is mindful of Section 13(2)(b) in particular, that prescribes that the office shall not be subject to the direction or control of any other person or authority in the performance of its functions, but shall be accountable to the Parliament. I also use this opportunity to highlight Section 14(1) of the Act, which sets out the scope of the powers of the office over public bodies, which include the Ministry of Finance. In keeping with Section 21 of the Act, which states that funds of the office shall consist of monies appropriated by Parliament for the purposes of the office, the Office of Procurement Regulation is a line item in the estimates of expenditure under the Ministry of Finance. Therefore, the Ministry of Finance has, over the period 2018 to 2020, appropriated sums for the operations of the Office of Procurement Regulations. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. May I ask and hereby invite the Chairman and Procurement Regulator, Mr. Lalchan, to make some brief opening remarks.
Thank you very much again, Chairman. And it is indeed a privilege this morning for us to be appearing before the committee to give an account for our stewardship over the last, and coincidentally, today, January 12th, makes it exactly 4 years since the first board of the OPR was appointed. And may I say that we have had a very successful 4 years. Most of the items that PS would have mentioned in terms of 13(1) of the Act, which sets out our mandate, we would have been able to complete a substantial portion of that and also have all our audited financial statements audited in time. And we are looking forward, based on some of the questions that were raised in preparation for this meeting, to enlighten the committee and the public in terms of our stewardship over the last 4 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman. I will initiate the questions and then my colleagues will join in thereafter. I recommend that if anyone else wants to intervene when questions are asked, feel free to do so. The objective of this session is to try to provide as much clarification and understanding of the operations of the committee, of your organization as much as possible. Okay, if I may begin. I want to congratulate you, and it's an odd way to begin this interrogation, as it will, of your financials, but I want to congratulate you for having provided a significant amount of information to this committee. I think since I have been here, which is a relatively short period of time of a little bit more than a year, this has been the most comprehensive submission that we have received as a committee, bar none. So I want to begin by congratulating the Office of Procurement Regulation for the amount of work that it has done so far over the period in persecuting and prosecuting your mandate. I noticed that in your submissions, you gave yourself an excellent rating in being able to fulfill your mandate. And I want to endorse that. So I start off with that a substantial amount of information is actually in the public domain based on what you have provided here and based on what I've seen on your website. But there are also other issues and other queries that emanate from this. I want to start by asking if you are of the view, Chairman, that sufficient funding has been provided to you for the fulfillment of your role and the exercise of the duties and responsibilities assigned to the OPR. Are you of the view that you have received sufficient funding for full execution of your portfolio?
Yes, and I would say very much so, Chair. We have been fully funded from day one, and so far we have been operating with a surplus for all the years under review. And even for this present fiscal, there is sufficient funding that we have received. In fact, we have received all our funding up until the end of December of 2021. So I would say the answer is yes. Additionally, just for the information of the committee, a number of projects that we would have undertaken was funded by external agencies. For example, the IADB, the European Commission, and that was significant. And many of the training opportunities that we have benefited from, we got funding and free from the Caribbean Court of Justice and also the judiciary in Trinidad, which was substantial. So we must say thanks to them. So yes, we are fully funded at this stage.
All right. Chairman, the effect of what you have set out to do is of critical importance to dealing with things like corruption, allegations of corruption, etc. So I think it was mentioned by the Ministry of Finance that your organization is completely independent, but you report to the Parliament. Can I confirm that?
That's confirmed.
Okay, so your role then as the procurement regulator and working at the Office of the Procurement Regulation is to do two things, if I am to gauge this legislation correctly. It is to use the public funds to establish procedures for the execution of projects, for the intention being to establish procedures for the disposal and acquisition of public property. Is that correct?
We were supposed to be acting on behalf of the state in terms of disposal of real and personal property under Section 13(1)(o). However, when the board took up office, one of our mandates, in addition to the others, is to conduct audit and investigation on those matters. And therefore, we saw it as a potential conflict to be engaged in the disposal of these property and also coming at the back end and actually auditing. So we did go to the Ministry of Finance and says that that's one of the areas we believe should not be under the purview of the office. However, we recommend another organization within the state sector should be responsible for that, but subject to the guidelines and the handbooks that we will develop that will give those guidelines as to how that particular part of the operation should be conducted. And in fact, we have included in the draft regulations, some regulations as it relates to the whole issue of retention and disposal of public property, but this only relates to personal property. The real property regulation still needs to be drafted by the Ministry of Finance. So that's how we envisage it to take place.
Thank you, Chairman. Just building on what you just mentioned to me, the regulations are now before the Parliament. Agreed. The organization has been, this legislation was passed, the legislation that set up the organization based on the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act 2015 was in fact approved in 2015, but only in 2018, my understanding is only from 2018 that you began the rollout of your organization, correct? With the appointment of the board?
Absolutely. And the parts of the act that were partially proclaimed in July of 2015 gave us certain mandates in terms of the setting up of the operations of the OPR and so on. So the first board actually was, yes, appointed in January 12th of 2018. And thereby we set out to give effect to the areas that were under the purview of the office under section 13.1. And probably at some stage we can give some more details insofar as where we are with those sections.
All right, Chairman, I'm curious as to find out if once a board was established, because you could not really have executed much until a board was actually in place. But once a board was established, the regulations which implemented the act should have been a matter of great priority. We are now in 2022. The board was set up in 2018, and we only now in Parliament having received the regulations. Can you advise what would have caused, or what was the reason for such a substantial delay in bringing the regulations, which would have given teeth to your board to do quite a few things?
So when the board was appointed, first of all, we had to get the funding and so on, office spaces, and actually recruit staff. So the first set of funding, I believe, was done in March. The office space was in April. And the first set of employees that came on board was July. And then we had to get a consultant on board. And that's where the consultant came through the IADB, free of charge to us, was on board. I believe it would have been around July, August of 2018. The regulations were actually, one of the things that we sought to do is to have public consultation. And therefore we had sessions in San Fernando, Port of Spain, and in Tobago in terms of soliciting the information that we require to draft those regulations. Together with the consultant, we visited these persons and we invited all the stakeholders, including organizations like the JCC. We had consultation with the Institute of Chartered Accountants, with the Institute of Internal Auditors, with a number of business like the Manufacturers Association, Chambers of Commerce, and so on, and also suppliers and contractors. And therefore, the first set of draft regulations were actually completed, I believe the date was November 21st or 23rd of 2018. Thereafter, it went through a number of stages, culminating in the present final submission to Parliament. So there were a number of areas that needed clarification. So we would have submitted it to the Ministry of Finance in November of 2018.
So question to the Ministry of Finance, Madam Permanent Secretary. If we have regulations, because the regulations are what really gave teeth to your board. If we have regulations that would have been submitted in 2018 to the Ministry of Finance, can Ministry of Finance indicate what would have been the reason for the delay? Because we now have funding that would have been presented and prepared and brought forward. We have a board that would have been put in place, and we have draft regulations submitted in November 2018. Can the Ministry of Finance explain why is it that from 2018 to November, December 2021, that time frame lapsed between when regulations were provided in draft form and when regulations actually came to Parliament to allow the board to have some teeth? Madam PS?
Thank you, Chairman. I don't have the timeline before me, but the initial suite of regulations were laid in Parliament in July 2021. What happened from November 2018? As Chairman just indicated, there was a series of consultations, including the Ministry of Finance and a team from the Ministry of Finance. We undertook a review, which were submitted for the office to comment. Another draft was submitted where we again deliberated and resubmitted to the office. Subsequently to that, then we, of course, would have to go through the process as all regulations, submissions to cabinet, and the deliberations at the Legislative Review Committee. All right, so that was the process that had to be undertaken. Once comments were fine-tuned by the Ministry of Finance, then the process for the whole LRC process took place after that. And the package was initially laid in July 2021.
Thank you very much, Madam Pierce. My concern is that this legislation was viewed as critical at the point in time when it was passed. The involvement of the board, the need for the board to have teeth to actually implement some of the programs that it had come up with, even up to today, is still being stalled. I want to ask the chairman of the procurement regulation, of the Office of the Procurement Regulator. I want to ask him if he thinks that the fact that it has taken so long before the regulations have come, well, it still has not yet been approved by Parliament. So you are still operating without regulations, but has that absence of regulations affected the ability of the office of your institution to completely and effectively undertake its mandate?
I would say partly, not fully, and I'll explain why I say that. When we were appointed in January of 2018, all we were given was the Act, and that was it. So we had to actually go through the Act in preparation for getting fully proclaimed. So even though in the early days, if we did have the regulations in place, there are other things that we would have had to do as a board to get fully proclaimed. For example, with the whole advent of the Central Tenders Board going away with the full proclamation, we had to get the different stakeholders in terms of the public bodies ready for this full proclamation. That means a substantial amount of training. So far, we have had 265 public consultation in terms of rolling out what is required. That's one of the areas in terms of educating the public and bringing them up to speed as to what is required. One of the substantial areas is in terms of pre-qualification of contractors and suppliers. Now, going forward, there will be one database of pre-qualified contractors held by the Office of Procurement Regulation. That is to avoid different treatments for different contractors and suppliers and so on. We have to actually set up that database. That database now is fully operationalized, and we have over 450, I believe, contractors have already come in. So that would have taken some time, and we only got that operationalized at December of more like September of 2021. That took a lot of time because we had to consult with all the suppliers and contractors and the public bodies. We also had to train public bodies in terms of how do they go about utilizing this database to actually do the necessary in terms of pre-qualification. And then we had to literally train a number of the officers. So now, under Section 61, each public body has to have a named procurement officer. And that person has to be trained and brought up to speed as to how they're going to execute the different functions. We literally had to write the handbooks and guidelines. And so far, we have delivered 41 of those handbooks and guidelines. Those handbooks and guidelines had to actually go through a process, again, of dealing with the different suppliers and contractors, the public bodies, getting the different nuances and so on sorted out. And once completed and written, approved by the OPR, we had now to go through the process of actually bringing the named procurement officers up to speed. So we had a number of consultation sessions again, San Fernando, Port of Spain, Tobago, where we would have brought them up to speed. So it was not just a matter of the regulation, but a number of bits and pieces under Section 13.1 had to be put in place. We had to have meeting with, like, for example, the Accreditation Council to look at accrediting our program in terms of what is required of a procurement officer. You have different levels. You have the senior, the manager is the senior, the junior, and so on. So what does it take to get these people ready, trained, and up to speed? And that would have taken some time. All those have been completed. So it was not only the regulation, but all the bits and pieces under Section 13.10 had to be put in place to prepare for the rollout of this particular act.
Thank you, Chair. The question, though, is whether you think at all that the absence of the regulations so far to date, whether that has impacted the ability of your board to fully execute its mandate.
Absolutely, and I would say the answer is yes, and I'll give you an example. So far, we have gotten 18 requests for investigations in terms of certain issues that persons would have faced. And that would have stymied our progress in terms of our ability to either conduct an audit or an investigation, although we have a full team on board and trained to do audit and investigation. So the process we would have observed is to take those, look at it, review it internally by our audit and investigation team. We didn't have the powers to do the audit and investigation, but what we could do is to assimilate a report coming out of the information that has been provided to us and write the various government ministers and PSs on all 18 for their action. Now, if we had the powers under the Act and the regulations, that would have been a different story. We could have actually conducted it and taken it if we believe that some offense was conducted in those areas, pass it through the DPP and so on. So the answer is yes, it did stymie our operationalization.
Thank you very much for your frankness in this matter, because it has raised a serious issue and concern for me as a public officer, and as I'm sure it has raised with other members of my committee and as well with your organization. I have, based on what you have said, you have tried to work as much, you've tried to do as much as you can do as an organization while you wait on the regulations. But while that has been happening, millions and billions of dollars have been spent on the award of contracts, etc. I have here, submitted by you, the Readiness Assessment Checklist Report of the Office of Procurement Regulation, dated April 2021. Now, this would have been prepared on the basis of your assessment or your request for information from, I believe it was 314 public bodies in terms of their readiness. So this data is what would have told you whether you have efficiently, you would have done your part in preparing documentation, but whether agencies of the government would have sufficiently been prepared for this legislation that exists now in law, for this legislation, and whether or not they have in place the relevant requirements to ensure transparency and accountability for the procurement, retention, and disposal of public property. And I'm raising that rather than asking questions because I want the listening audience to be aware of what this report says. I will ask you if, in fact, before I go there, I want to find out if this is the latest Readiness Assessment Checklist Report. This is the one from April 2021. Is this the most recent assessment that you have?
That is the most recent one that we have compiled.
And I'm sure, like me, this would have given you great cause for concern, because what this told me is out of 314 bodies which were asked to report on their state of readiness for the implementation of the Public Procurement, Retention, and Disposal of Public Property Act, passed in 2015, which is what we are trying to roll out now, which is to prevent corruption, which is to encourage transparency and accountability. That out of 314 organizations to which you would have expected responses, only 20 provided responses. That is what this readiness assessment checklist report says. The vast majority, 296 entities, did not submit at all a report to the Office of Procurement Regulator indicating whether they had documentation, personnel, support, financing to implement the legislation or any of the guidelines, any of the procedures, any of the protocols that you would have prepared in the last 4 years. 296 out of 314. That is 93.6% did not even have the courtesy to respond to the Office of Procurement Regulator. So whilst you are doing a phenomenal job in putting in place the documentation, it appears to me that public bodies, government agencies are not in fact either being respectful of your office or whether they are in fact willing to supply information as required by law to you. Maybe the regulations will help, but I am deeply concerned as a public officer, as I'm sure you are. I am deeply concerned that billions of dollars have been spent by these organizations and there are no mechanism in place for ensuring transparency, accountability, and the absence of corruption in the procurement, retention, and disposal of public property. I raise that because this report is damning. This report is damning. Over 84% of the organizations don't even have an organizational structure and a delegation of authority for a public procurement officer. The figures are frightening. 34 out of 314 organizations, only 34 have recruited and developed and retained competent individuals to oversee the implementation of this regulation, of these documents that you have provided. 20 out of 314 do not have persons who are capable of maintaining stores. What I'm seeing here by this assessment report, and I congratulate you for providing it, because this is a true representation of what exists outside, what exists in the state sector, which is that a large number of state enterprises, 314, only 20 out of 314 had the courtesy to respond. And 70 responded. Out of the 70 out of 314, only 20 had any sort of procurement code of conduct in place. That is frightening. Mr. Chairman, do you agree that that is a serious issue of concern?
It's a definite area of concern. But if I may say, Chair, that there was no, even though we made the request, there was no authority to compel them to respond because that part of the act was not proclaimed. But it is a little bit more troubling than what you would have highlighted, Chair, because the ones that we would have circulated and asked for responses in terms of their readiness assessment is just part of the overall public bodies, because public bodies are also defined as those who use public money. And the funds, we did not circulate them because we had to get that information from public bodies to tell us who they give funding to. And that would have been a separate request we would have made to others outside of the core of what we defined as public bodies. The second thing that we wanted to do is that even though we asked for the information on a voluntary basis, we wanted to get an idea of the tasks that we have to perform to bring them up to speed in terms of their readiness assessment. So what we do is that we develop our programs, and especially our outreach program, to coincide with where the deficiencies are and to assist them in bringing them up to speed. So that was a twofold reason that we would have conducted the survey. So we still have a huge body of work to deal with those who fall under the definition of utilizing public money as a second wave of the readiness assessment. So it does concern us.
Chairman, I want to repeat that I'm deeply concerned that organizations that have accounts from that spend state money have not agreed. This is voluntary, but they should have been anxious to provide information to the Office of the Procurement Regulation because they must know that this is coming into force. They must know that regulations are going to be approved on which they must then comply. I commend you for your interest in prosecuting this matter because of the fact that if the 93% of the entities had supplied their information, you would have been able, I'm sure, you would have been able to be advised as to how you can ensure that they can provide support. You can provide support to them to make sure that they come up to scratch. In the absence of that, we have a situation where we have funds being expended, but no desire by these entities, from my understanding, I'm subject to correction, we have no desire from these entities to ensure that their structures are in place for accountability and transparency. That is a deeply troubling issue. I have two of my colleagues who want to weigh in at this point. Ms. John, I yield to you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Chairman of the OPR, I was a little bit concerned when you said the lack of regulations really didn't hamper your operations because you were kind of on a parallel track of getting your internal business organized, and that's fine. But I still believe, here you are, and without the regulations, you really cannot, you can't move ahead. Now, the fact that you have also stated that you cannot compel these bodies to comply because the particular portion of the act is yet to be announced. I mean, that to be proclaimed. That is a very serious issue. So then, what then is your role? You understand? I mean, and are you writing and asking because you are talking about the knock-on effect? But another troubling thing is the level of readiness, because notwithstanding, and I also want to commend you of the 265 consultations, etc., and the contractors who have signed up. What I want to know is that these are people with different levels of interest coming from different sectors, business interests, different activities, etc. How are you going to harmonize your activity and what you have to do in terms of the tools you're going to use for investigation? Because what I heard you say is that the 18 complaints that are before you are hamstrung to handle them because it would have meant you investigating and moving straight to the DPP. Is there a straight line from you to the DPP, or how are you then going to say, I'm satisfied that there is some level of wrongdoing, and then to go to the DPP, or is there a process you have laid out where you give people an opportunity to explain themselves? I just want to hear about that. How are you going to harmonize? And then that 18, I want to just reiterate that you said you have passed on to the minister or the ministry. How are you passing it on? Are you in a position to undertake any level of investigation and then say the minister, I cannot move further because I don't have the necessary tools in law, but at least I want to give you a heads up, as it were. I want to indicate to you that this is what we feel is happening so that the minister can get involved, or whoever, the permanent secretary, I suppose, is the better person in that regard.
Thank you very much, member, for those questions. So the first one, in terms of being hamstrung, you're quite right. We cannot conduct the level of investigation, but once we have the powers to conduct those investigations, we have a direct line to take it to the DPP once we are satisfied that a breach of the act in terms of an offense has been committed. So we pass on the file work. In fact, we have already met with the DPP. and set up the relationship in terms of how do we get involved in. And he said that the person in the DPP's office who we deal with is himself directly. So that has been done. Now, in terms of the 18 that we were brought to our attention, what we do is that we looked at the information that is provided. We assess the information in terms of best practice and what is required under the Act in terms of present legislation, because we cannot make a determination based on the new legislation until it's fully proclaimed. So based on what we know in terms of the present legislation, for example, the SEMP manual and the operations of the Central Tenders Board and so on, what we would have done is to look at the information and say, do we believe that they were in compliance with these different instructions? And in most of the cases, there were cause for concern. And in our letter to the various ministries and permanent secretary, we will say, we believe there is a cause for concern, A, B, C, D, E, based on the information that has been provided, without making a conclusion, and ask for them to conduct the relevant internal investigation to determine if something went wrong, in fact. So that's how we deal with the 18, because we cannot make a determination. We don't have the necessary wherewithal under the Act to do the investigation. So those were the...
Sorry, Chairman, one last one. So with that now, okay, so that will be a kind of inconclusive approach. I'm not blaming you for that, but I'm just saying this is what you're doing. What happens when, if and when this you have the tools in hand? Are you then going to retrace your step and see with these 18 or?
Well, based on the advice that we would have gotten under Section 70 of the Act, Section 70 provides a level of investigation that we conduct, but we cannot conduct it under the new legislation. For example, if there were certain contracts that were awarded under, for example, the Central Tenders Board mandate, we can investigate it under the CTB Act, because that was what was in effect at the point in time, but not under the new legislation. So that's how we will get the powers to investigate under the Section 70, because we did solicit senior counsel's advice on it.
Thank you, Chairman.
If I may just to build on that before I open the floor to two of my other colleagues, though. The Central Tenders Board Act, under which you can only act now, was restricted in its applicability, restricted in the range of actions that could have taken, which is why this new piece of legislation was put in place. So therefore, what you are saying is that you are unable to maximize the use of the current piece of regulations, or current piece of documentation, current piece of legislation, because of the fact that it has not yet been proclaimed. Is that correct to say, sir?
That is correct, Chairman.
Is that not very, very frightening that we are in 2022 after this act had been passed in 2015 and board established, etc., and a lot of footwork has been done in preparing documentation? Isn't it not frightening that we still do not have the teeth to use the resources that have been waived at us through the act, the new act in 2015? We still don't have the teeth to implement that act, and therefore we may have had the situation where in the last, between 2015 and now, activities may have been allowed to get away. Persons may have been allowed to get away with illicit activity because the regulations and the legislation has not been put in place or is not updated enough to pick up on the failures that the old CTV legislation would have functioned under?
Chair, I would like to say that the regulations will give us the powers to do a lot more, and also require a certain type of behavior from public bodies that will make a big difference in the country in terms of the whole issue of value for money, transparency, accountability, and so on. So I agree that...
Yeah, I agree with that, Chair. Sorry to interrupt. I agree with that the current legislation, once it's fully implemented, would give you substantial teeth. And that's the concern that I have, that it's not yet been fully implemented. And therefore, we are operating under archaic legislation, which we already accept is not up to task, which is why we have the new legislation. Have you raised those concerns with the Ministry of Finance in an effort in somehow or the other to encourage them to expedite the process?
Well, in all the discussions we have had at different levels within the Ministry of the finance and also at the LRC sessions and so on, we have indicated those. And we have also, every time we get an opportunity in terms of the public domain, in the press and so on, we reiterate that it is imperative that we get these regulations done as quickly as possible to give teeth to the OPR. So we have done it at the ministries level and also at the public level.
Thank you. I have member Sipasad who wanted to ask some questions. Ma'am?
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman, like you, when I read the report, this is the readiness assessment report, I am of the view that while all the other bits and pieces have been put in place, without the teeth of the legislation and the regulations, the tremendous work done by the Office of the Procurement Regulator really comes to naught. I mean, I'm not discounting their work, and don't get me wrong, but the effectiveness is really naught, as well as the fact that 20 out of 314 entities, which is 6%, are the only people that have developed and implemented the code of conduct, etc. There are two questions that I have. How many other entities, Chairman, through you to the procurement regulator, do you are targeted to fall under your office? Because you said the 314 were the government entities, etc. And how many of those are ready? As well as, have you been given any indication as to when the regulations will be debated in Parliament and passed so that you can then now begin your real work?
So thank you very much, Member, and through you, Chair. The regulations, we are aware that it was placed on the order paper in the Senate yesterday. And it is on the order paper for the lower house on Friday of this coming week. And it was actually laid in the lower house on the 13th of December, I believe, after it was laid on July the 2nd. So we feel confident based on the assurances, and I have had discussion with both the Minister of Finance substantive and the Junior Minister of Finance in terms of taking it forward. So I feel confident that that has taken place. But the other question I believe you had raised is in terms of the readiness. There are a number of organizations, and I'll give you a couple of examples. TNTech. We just had a session with over 300 of TNTech employees at all levels of the organization. We had a joint session recently with Heritage, NGC, Water and Sewerage Authority, a joint session in terms of how we can assist them in terms of developing. We just got a clarification from Caribbean Airlines that they have adopted our handbooks and guidelines, certain of our handbooks and guidelines. The same for Plebdeco. A number of ministries actually started reporting, and I can tell you the Ministry of Labor has already started reporting on their quarterly contracts that they have been awarding. And SwimCall is also a number of state enterprise that have been reporting. So whereas it is voluntary, we have a number of organizations that have already started to operate as if the legislations are in place. So far, we have gotten over 600 requests for information and advice in terms of public procurement. And I believe you would have put that in the report also. How do we do this? How do we do that? Are we doing this correctly? And so on. So there is some of the public bodies that are really inclined on moving forward. Others, not so much because of their state of readiness and so on. So I hope I would have given you a flavor as to where we are with it.
So that, Chairman, if I could just piggyback on that, so that if when you redo this readiness assessment report, it would look considerably better?
We are hoping that it will because of the number of interventions we would have had recently. And for example, again, we had a full session with the annual procurement plan, which is mandatory in terms of 6 weeks after the reading of the national budget. We have so far received 30 of those annual procurement plans that we are reviewing. And we have a number of requests. So much requests came in terms of the preparation of the annual procurement plan that we are planning another session to roll out even another session in terms of the annual procurement plan, which is very essential in terms of giving the information to the public in terms of what contracts that will be awarded in the ensuing 12-month period. So we expect it to be better. Would it be perfect? The answer is no. We have a lot of work still to do in terms of upskilling the different public bodies in respect of their readiness.
And one last question. Given that the Act came into effect in 2015, and when the regulations are proclaimed, you will then have the wherewithal to do what you're supposed to do in a large measure. How are you going to deal with the backlog of issues from 2015 come forward? Do you have a plan to deal with that, or what are you going to do?
Well, it will be based on the nature of the issues that are coming forward. Those that would be requiring investigation, we do have the authority under the Act. If we don't have sufficient resources internally to conduct those investigations, we can outsource some of it. So that will be that part of it. In terms of challenge proceedings and ineligibility, those will not be retroactive. Those are moving forward. And we have the teams already trained to deal with the ineligibility and also the challenge proceedings. We did get, as I mentioned, training from the judiciary and the Caribbean Court of Justice to prepare those committees to deal with hearings and procedures in terms of decision making and so on.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Member Leons, you had some queries that you wanted to raise?
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. Chairman of the Office of Procurement Regulations, congratulations on your work. Actually, Ms. Sipsi Prasad would have brought some of the questions I had. I was really trying to find out, after your report, which would have been about 10 months ago, what strategies that you had to improve the response, and if there was any expected change in the data. But as you would have just indicated, a number of agencies would have had a number of meetings and sessions, and there's a lot of interest by a number of our public institutions in terms of getting themselves ready. How, in your view, would that impact your report that was 10 months ago? And what strategies do you have to continue and improve your responses?
Thank you very much, Member, and through you, Chair. What we have done is to develop online training system that once we conduct a training session, for example, in terms of evaluation of contracts, annual procurement plans, as I mentioned, how do you prepare requests for proposals and so on. Those sessions we actually had in Trinidad, in North and South, and in Tobago, and we actually tape the sessions. So for example, questions come up and we have frequently asked questions and so on. When that comes up, we point these persons to those sessions. Depending on the amount of requests we get, we look at and we track it on a weekly and a daily basis in terms of the common requests that we get, and we develop our training program. We have recently developed our learning management system. What our learning management system has is that we have put in place modules where any procurement person within the ministries or the public bodies could come in and self-taught and be certified after a period of time. And we have recently rolled out our requirements for certification of the different levels. We had the procurement officers attend, the accounting officers attend, and the Institute of Higher Education in the country through the Accreditation Council also attended. So we had over 300 and something persons attend those sessions. Again, to bring them up to speed in terms of what is required, but more importantly, how you can develop your staff and yourself by utilizing the resources that we have. So what we intend to do is to have regular assessments done, not only for the readiness, but different areas of assessment, and use that as a basis for developing our forward plan to make sure that we are keeping in touch with what is required by the different stakeholders. We also have a number of sessions with, like, for example, the Contractors Association, the Manufacturers Association. And what we also did is to have sessions with the Institute of Chartered Accountants and internal auditors so that we highlighted them what is required under the Act so that they can start looking in at the public bodies to ask relevant questions in terms of their readiness assessment to take advantage of the Act and so on. So all those are strategies that we would have developed.
One other question. In your response to these, your strategic plan, you would have indicated about 50% of persons you would have rolled out your regulations, your handbooks and stuff. Has that program continued, and what is your percentage now?
We would have rolled out, it's difficult to say the percentage, but we can also always revert back to you on the percentage. But we continue to have those rollout sessions on a predominantly weekly basis based on requests. And then, as I said before, if we have common requests, we have a massive rollout session, which, for example, we would have done with the APP and so.
Okay, and finally, in the absence of the regulations approval, which based on what we are saying, it should be done soon. What follow-up do you do from your submissions to the ministers? You said that once you identify certain issues, you write to the ministers and you suggest or you recommend actions. What follow-up does your organization do in terms of the issues and how to close out if these issues was resolved and if it is closed out?
We request feedback, and in some cases we would get feedback, but we don't follow up to say on a regular basis, tell us what is happening with these investigations, because really we don't have the power. So out of courtesy, we follow up some of the issues, especially the high profile ones. And we did get resolutions to some of those.
All right, thanks a lot, Chair. And again, congratulations on your good work.
Member Brown, I know that you had some questions that you wanted to raise. You can do so now.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning once again to the team that is responding. I want to begin by congratulating you and your team on the excellent work the office has done thus far, and for your very transparent responses to the committee before today in your submissions and during the course of this morning's meeting. I must say that your office appears to be fully up to the task at hand, and I'm tempted to recall some of the negativity and the doom and gloom that surrounded the setting up period, and there were so many concerns expressed, and some of those concerns were quite validly posited at the time. And I want to say that you've done very well in the brief years since the initial establishment of this office in recruiting some very professional human resources that can serve this, has been serving and can serve this country extremely well. I noted the exchanges a short while ago with respect to the readiness assessment report, and it sort of reminded me of the importance of improving the overall appreciation and interest in the best possible procurement procedures. I'm across society, including within our public bodies, there isn't sufficient appreciation. I know there's been some public outreach work and direct work with officers. I feel more of that can be done because there's this overall culture against which I'm sure you would find yourself pressing from time to time. I feel that there are some factors that could be improved as you continue interacting with public office holders. And of course, these challenges are not limited to one political entities of one stripe or the other, but include regional corporations, etc. Chair, I know 4 years might seem a long time when you're in the organization, but in terms of the history and setup, I don't think it is a long time at all. I want to ask you, with respect to your human resource capacity, the quality of professionals you've been able to attract. I'm very impressed at this stage, but are there areas of staffing that, in your opinion, require further strengthening? Could you share that a bit with the committee at this time? The other thing I want to ask you is, to what extent have you been able to contribute to the regulations that are now before the Parliament? I understand due to be debated on in a short while in the lower house and then to the Senate. How have you and your team been able to contribute to the shaping of those regulations? And finally, getting back to my initial point, I would appreciate your thoughts on how your work can impact on the overall culture of laissez-faire and cutting corners that seems to have become very much a part of this society. How can your public education and outreach efforts be further expanded as we move forward? I would appreciate your thoughts on these things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Member, and through you, Chair. Allow me to take the last question first, and there is a reason why I want to handle that first. We believe that it's going to be a difficult climb to change the existing culture that we constantly face with on a regular basis. So what we did, and you would see as our, and I would like to read it, our vision is to be the catalyst for transformation through best practice in procurement, retention, and disposal of public property. And it was very clearly stated that the catalyst for transformation, and that transformation you would see was not restricted to only the issue of procurement and disposal and retention of the public property. We believe that if we get, and when we get this whole issue of procurement right, that could be transformational to other areas. So we are trying to set the standards to do that. One of the things that we have done, and we are about to roll out, unfortunately, the COVID-19 has impacted us severely. We are going to go on a major drive in our schools, primary schools and secondary schools. We have already developed the program. We have printed over 1,000 booklets that teaches the kids about things like transparency, accountability, value for money, the proposition. And we are about to roll out that. We have had significant discussions with the Ministry of Education, and we have taken on board all their comments and so. So once COVID allows us, we will be embarking on that, and it will be in the form of classroom interaction, competitions, and also radio ads, television ads, and so on, in terms of what we expect. We also have a number of areas that we will be educating the public on in terms of the whole issue of integrity, transparency, through a number of, we have about 3 radio ads and 2 television ads that we are developing. The radio ads have been completed, the television is soon to be completed. We could not tape it because of the COVID restrictions and couldn't get persons on board. So in terms of the culture, that's part of our mandate in terms of changing the culture, not only in procurement and disposal of public property and retention, but overall in society. So we believe we have an important role to play. In terms of the regulations were 100% done by our internal resources together with our consultants and prepared and submitted to the Ministry of Finance. And those were done in consultation with all the stakeholders I would have mentioned before. So we were the ones that, and that was required, I believe, under Section 63 of the Act, that we prepare for consideration of the Ministry of Finance, the regulations. And that's why I said it would have been prepared and submitted in November of 2018. In terms of the employees, there are some areas that we had on hold pending the full proclamation. And those areas have to do with the Secretariat. The Secretariat will be responsible for the actual hearings of the hearing proceedings and so on. And that team is now being put in place. We have the second part of the interview for the head of the Secretariat and some of the legal officers. We are about to give offers there. We do have a very good cadre of persons applying for these positions. Something about the Office of Procurement Regulations attract a number of good candidates. In fact, sometimes we get in the hundreds of applicants and some very good applicants. So we are attracting the right level of persons, and we will continue to do so. As I said, Secretariat is one of the areas. We have just recruited 3 audit and investigation additional officers to deal with some of the issues that we have to deal with. And what we have done, and you would see it in our training details, we are training our employees to do things that otherwise we would have outsourced. For example, we have 3 of our officers trained in terms of strategic planning, 2 of our board members in terms of corporate governance. Our IT sector, you will see the internet, the intranet, and our board portals all were done internally by our internal resources. So we have trained up and upskilled our employees to deal with those issues. So those are some of the things that we are looking at. And presently, although it's not in place, we are now looking at our whole succession plan so that when key staff leaves, we will have persons ready to take over those roles from our internal resources. We are also training our board members in terms of taking on the responsibility of hearing proceedings and so on. So all that has been put in place. So I hope I did do justice to your questions.
Very much so. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Chairman. If I may, I want to continue my line of questioning. Would you be able to provide this committee with any kind of indication as to how much money on average? I suspect that it may be a fluctuating figure. I'm not sure even if that you would be aware of a value, but how much money on average is spent by these 314 plus the others that you have not yet engaged entities? How much money would have been spent by those entities, bearing in mind that so many of them have not provided you with any indication of how prepared they are to implement the regulations that are forthcoming? Do you have any idea of a dollar value?
We can get that from the budget allocation. That's an easy place to get it from. We also, when we have requests for sensitization sessions on the state enterprises, one of the first things we ask them to do is do a presentation to us in terms of their mandate, what they are required to do, and also their budget allocations for the various procurement activities that they will undertake. But that would be would say an incomplete list, because it would only be the ones that we would have had the interaction with. So we can pull it from the budget annual statement. We have been using a rule of thumb in terms of potentially out of the $52 billion allocated in the national budget, about $26 billion if spent on procurement, but that does not include some of the self-sufficient organizations like the FCBs, the Heritage, the NGCs, and so on. So that will be a separate set of information we'll have to get. That is probably something that we can look at through the budget and through asking the relevant state enterprises and public entities for the information. It is probably going to take us a while to put.
All right, so just for the viewing audience, on average, 26 billion, just an average figure, falls under what would be considered your purview for the execution of contracts, the disposal of retention, and acquisition of public property, correct? On average, 26 billion per year?
Per year, in terms of the whole issue of procurement, acquisition of assets, big constructions, and so on.
All right. I raised that because I want to emphasize, and I actually now want to get maybe you can respond, or you may want your head legal to respond. What kind of action can be taken? I've noticed in the same readiness report, this bone of contention that we have, this is your significant concern, is that that public bodies are required to submit an annual procurement plan to the OPR by law under section 27(1)(a) of the Act, that's the Public Procurement Act. And they must do that within a fixed time frame. But only 4 out of 314 had done that as at April 2021, based on your request. Only 4 out of 314. Mind you, we already indicated that there are other agencies which have not been brought into this ambit yet. So it's more than 314, but for now, for what we're looking at, only 4 out of 314 entities actually submitted what was required by law, an annual procurement plan to the OPR. Is there any legal recourse that the OPR can take to ensure that these entities and the other entities in particular who have not complied, is there any action that the OPR can take to ensure compliance? Or is it that the Ministry of Finance must therefore take some sort of action? How do we fix this? Chairman?
Thank you, Chair. That part of the Act is not proclaimed, and therefore they are under no obligation. But we have actually increased those numbers, and now we have received 30 since that report, and since we would have rolled out the APP training session. So that part of the Act, unfortunately, is not proclaimed.
So thank you for that. That only mildly alleviates my concern, because now we have 30 of the 314. That is still not a substantial figure. Can the Ministry of Finance indicate what they are able to do, both in terms of ensuring that the entire Act is proclaimed as soon as possible, and also in terms of ensuring that the entities that are required to provide information to the OPR do so in an expeditious manner, so that the OPR can assist in filling in the gaps and clearing the misconceptions and providing the legal and other frameworks to ensure that we have transparency, accountability, and efficiency in the use of state resources. Can the Ministry of Finance advise what actions they are able to take to ensure that these things happen? Or maybe head legal? I'm sorry, Madam PS, you were speaking?
I was about to explain, Chairman, as regulators have stated that section of the Act is not proclaimed. So when the debate concludes, following from Friday, we expect that proclamation will be imminent. The Ministry of Finance doesn't have a role in this respect for taking any punitive action as regards to the obligations of public bodies under the Act. And I would allow the head legal to bail me out here.
Ms. Mitchell? Just to follow up, just to remind you, what we're trying to figure out is how we can get, what actions can be taken at this point to ensure some level of compliance with the requests for information by the OPR.
At this point in time, Chair, there isn't, as the PS would have indicated and the Chairman, it is a section that is not yet proclaimed. However, upon full proclamation, there is a provision under 27(2) whereby it is if the information is not forthcoming, an investigation can be undertaken by the OPR. Also, under the regulations, there's provision for non-compliance with an instruction that is given. So we expect that once it is the regulations is passed with the full proclamation of the Act, we will have the teeth that you referred to give effect to some of our powers.
Is it of concern, though, that we may be in a situation where, God willing, sometime this year, the regulations are passed and the entire Act, therefore, is assented to and implemented, that we have a flood of issues that now comes to OPR for attention, because we have a substantial number of bodies. I understand what the OPR was trying to do. It was trying to prepare the agencies for the implementation of the Act, so that you don't have all of a sudden all these agencies now down your throat trying to get clarification as to how they have to, what they need to do, etc., in order to ensure that they comply with the law. But let me ask a question differently. What have you put in place? This will come back to Chairman. What have you put in place to ensure that when the legislation is fully implemented now, when it's fully assented to, when the regulations are approved and the rest of the Public Procurement Act is assented to, once that happens, what has the OPR put in place to ensure that at the quickest possible time, we can have all of these entities which have failed to comply thus far, we can have them in full compliance with the law? Chairman?
Thank you very much, Chairman. There are some areas that we will look at in terms of allowing a transition period. And I'll give you, for example, the database of pre-qualified contractors. We will allow the public bodies to use their existing database for a period of 6 months to allow a transition into the new system and be familiar with it. And so that's one of the areas. But some of the other areas that require immediate action, we will require the public bodies to take those immediate action. There will be no transition period for those. But based on some of the areas, there will be a transition period, and we'll deal with it on a case-by-case basis, for example, the database and so on. But some of the things in terms of the handbooks and guidelines, the ability of the office to develop those is proclaimed. So handbooks and guidelines was proclaimed. So we expect those 41 handbooks and guidelines for persons to adopt it on day one. So it will be on an individual case-by-case basis how we transition to the new law. For example, I believe the Central Tenders Board has a 3 months transition to no longer be in existence after the full proclamation.
Chair, the thing is that you have the documentation in hand. The question is, how do you then police the actual, how do you then ensure that these agencies have put it in place? Your readiness report has indicated that the vast majority, literally the vast majority, do not even have personnel in place yet designated as a procurement officer, somebody responsible for this agency. How then, what do you have in place to monitor outside of asking them to submit information 1 year thereafter? How do you police the immediate implementation of these manuals that you have provided? How do you then police to make sure that what is there is actually in place?
We will be exercising our right to audit with the audit and investigation team. And that right to audit is enshrined in the present Act. And once proclaimed, we can utilize our trained officers. And it does not necessarily mean that we will only use auditors to do audit in terms of the readiness assessment. We can use some of our officers in the other areas which we plan to do to actually go and work with the organization. So that's how we plan to deal with it. In fact, I'll give you an idea, an example. I hope the Chief Secretary doesn't mind, but we did meet with the THA last Friday, for a session with all the secretaries and undersecretaries. And we have an invitation from the Chief Secretary to come to Tobago to conduct that assessment in terms of their readiness, because they are one of the organizations that started this process a little while ago. And he wants us to come literally do an audit on the THA and find out where they are in terms of readiness. So we are hoping to use our audit functions to do just that.
Well, I commend the THA for that initiative, because on the one hand, we see the THA at this point being, and the head of the THA at this point, willing to submit themselves to audit. But on the other hand, we have all these agencies who seem to be unwilling to provide basic information. Just for my information and for the committee, can you advise if Section 36 of the Act has been proclaimed?
Section 36, let me just check that, please, Chairman.
That is the section that deals with the requirement for published notices of award of procurement contracts or framework.
No, that has not been proclaimed. However, I did mention before, Chair, that there are two organizations that off my head, I could recall. The Ministry of Labor does it on a quarterly basis, and SwimCall does it on a quarterly basis. And those are doing it voluntarily.
All right, so basically what you're saying is that you are quite challenged by the absence of the regulations and by the fact that these various subcomponents, these various clauses of the Act have not in fact been proclaimed.
That statement could not be repeated again and again to really tell us that we really need the regulations to give effect to a number of things. And just to go back to a point, Chair, with the $26 billion, what we have found out based on our research is that the OECD did a research document that mentioned that between 10 and 30% of publicly funded operations in terms of procurement is lost through corrupt practices. And that was also done by the EU. So at back of the envelope, if we say 20% of that 26 billion, potentially we can literally be saving on an annual basis $5.2 billion, just based on those statistical figures. So yes, we really need the regulations as quickly as possible and full proclamation.
So you have highlighted in one sentence the reason why I am extremely concerned, and we as a committee are extremely concerned based on the readiness report and based on the fact that we have had quite a bit of time waiting on these regulations. I know one of my colleagues said that 4 years is not a long time. And I agree with him, it's not a very long time in this creation of this, for the creation of this entity, but it's a substantial amount of money that could have leaked out at a point in time when this country cannot afford it. Hence the reason why I think the Ministry of Finance really needs to get a little bit more aggressively involved in ensuring that these entities, and I'm not too sure I'm in full agreement with the Permanent Secretary in terms of not having a role, but the Ministry of Finance is responsible for all accounts of the country, the government expenditure generally. And therefore, these entities which spend government money falls directly under the Ministry of Finance. So that's why the Ministry of Finance is here today. And therefore, I would appeal to the Ministry of Finance to do whatever is required to ensure that between now and even if the regulations take a couple of weeks or a couple more months to get passed through the parliamentary system and to get assented to by the president, that as much can be done between now and then to ensure readiness on the part of these 314 plus agencies that have not indicated a desire to bring their accounts to order or to bring their accounts to account. I am appealing to the Ministry of Finance to put a bit more of an active hand in this, and really to allow the Office of the Procurement Regulation to do what I think it is set up to do. And from all accounts, you have done your part. You've put your structures in place, but you are waiting on the teeth to ensure that this 5.2, I am very concerned about these kind of figures at a point in time when we have persons doing without We have resources collapse. We have various agencies that are able to get sufficient resources to them. Chairman, if I may ask one more question. I hear a sigh of relief. In relation to the OPR's function under Section 13(8) of the Act, which is to audit and review the system of procurement and disposal of public property to ensure compliance with the objectives of the Act, the OPR stated that an audit and investigation team was established and a code of ethics had been developed for public bodies and suppliers. I'm trying to get engaged, so if you can advise, what is the current state of that code of ethics?
So, Chair, with your permission, I'll ask our corporate secretary who spearheaded that part of the drafting and approval of those code of ethics to give an update on where we are with it. I'll ask Delrin Liverpool Young.
Good afternoon to members of the committee and to the chairman. So we would have drafted two documents. We would have drafted a code of ethics for named procurement officers and public bodies, as well as a code of ethics for suppliers and contractors operating within the procurement framework. Thus far, we would have ruled out the two documents to both suppliers and contractors, as well as public bodies, and those sensitization and rollout sessions are on the office's website.
All right, so that would be the code of ethics as different from a code of conduct, correct?
So what we actually call it is a guideline on conduct. But within the document, it speaks to ethical principles. So within the document, we would touch on concern, for example, areas of conflict of interest.
All right, I want to open the floor to find out if any of my colleagues have any further questions or issues that they would want to raise at this time.
Yes, Chairman, if I may. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. John.
Yes, I just wanted to know, in terms of how the chairman, through you, how the chairman is going to kind of consolidate or harmonize the processes with respect to auditing. How are you going to work? Because you have different organizations undertaking different activities. How are you going to harmonize this activity for your own management, as it were?
Thank you very much, Member, through your chair. What we have done is to look at a risk-based approach in the initial stages to the audit of those organizations. So based on the high-risk, high-value items, we will be prioritizing those as one of the areas of identifying. And some of the larger organizations will require a different approach to auditing as opposed to some of the smaller organizations. For example, among the regional corporations, we'll have a standard approach because their activities were more or less in line with one another. Regional Health Authority, ministries. But within the ministries, you will have probably larger ministries with larger spend, and therefore those will be prioritized in terms of how we conduct those audits. So it will be based on a risk-based approach to identifying and conducting those audits. We have just completed our audit manual for use, and that will be reflected in the audit manual, how our selection criteria goes in terms of the sample testing for those organizations.
Mm-hmm. Chairman, one more question, please. I'm concerned, and I think other members have expressed the same concern, in terms of this level of readiness, because when you have your regulations assented to, etc. Now you have some specific timelines. You have said like 3 months. I don't know if those are in the law. I was just trying to look at it again with respect to when folks are expected to comply. And currently, you are saying out of hundreds of organizations, only 2 are voluntarily trying to submit their quarterly reports, when more or less everybody should be trying to comply at this time, so they get used to it. Given you are moving from 0 to DPP, I think people don't quite understand the seriousness of what is being undertaken. You understand in terms of getting us in line with I guess the value for money test, etc. So, Chairman, is it possible that even at this time when everything looks imminent, forego, that one can send out, I know it's more work on top of work, but I suppose this is to help you that we don't end up in a mess when you are ready to go to every single organization who that you can identify and kind of look at them and say, where are we now? You are here now, specifically to the organization. You have 10 steps to complete, but of the 10, you have done 3. You have 6 steps to complete. Of the 6 of the 10, you have done 6, so you have 4 outstanding. So that we can give people some outstanding, so they know that already they are being managed and monitored, and you're really getting them ready. As I said, it's a long way to get people used to this level of management, especially by an external source. Now, I'm not telling you how to do your business, but you say you write to the minister, who of course is the overall head. But is it that you are also writing to what is known as the accounting officer, whether the PS or the managing director or the chairman of the board? Because I think when you are writing relative to the organization, everybody with an interest perhaps in law ought to be written to, given the seriousness of this exercise to be undertaken by your board.
Member, you're quite right, and through your chair, we do write, for example, if we are sending a note to the named procurement officer, we copy the accounting officer. And if we send it to the accounting officer, we copy the named procurement officer. We have had several sessions jointly with the accounting officer and the named procurement officers. The reason why and just to elaborate on the seriousness of the matter, once the Central Tenders Board goes away, all the organizations that depended on them to do their procurement activity and their disposal to the Board of Survey and so on, that goes away. And if they are not ready to take up the mantle in terms of the procurement by appointing their procurement officers and so on, they will be without any props. And therefore, you can well find some of the procurement activities being stymied. And that's what we're trying to avoid by making sure that Central Tenders Board goes away. You have to stand on your own 2 feet. You need to start thinking about those activities now, not when it happens on full proclamation. So that's the reason why I mentioned the CTB.
Ms. John, any follow-up?
Yes, sir. The last question. Hold on. I had another question. With respect to the planned procurement activity coming after the budget is read, some folks, I mean, you can't, a lot of times, not a lot, an organization is dynamic. So you might have the big work that you have planned for, but you will have other works which will maybe come available or come due based on what in contract they call a force majeure activity. That is, I've seen that you have made provision for that. It's there in the law, but in practice, certainly, sometimes it is just something you overlooked, or even in the scale of a contract. Sometimes you're doing a scope of work, and you may, in your investigation, you may have missed something, maybe in the soil test, etc. Is there provision for that? Is it that the organization will have to come to you in advance, make sure and come to you to have the approval before they kind of do a variation or things like that?
No, that is not required. What is required is that once you have the funding and so on to do it, you have to now republish your annual procurement list of activities, amend it. So once you have a major amendment to your list, you have to republish it, and that is provided for in the main body of the Act.
No, it's not only that, Chairman. I'm asking. I'm now going to in terms of a specific piece of work. If when you are doing the work, something comes up, because things come up all the time. Meaning, as I said, you might test your soil or you're going down, and some event may have happened. And I took the time to look at the qualifications of the various members of the board, and I have to congratulate you. You have a well-qualified board also, I mean, with a vast array of experience and qualification. But I'm just saying, when you start to do this work, something will pop up, some area of activity that you had not catered for in your budget, but it is a material issue, where you will have to expend additional funding. That's what I'm talking about. This wonderful thing they call variation in contract. They come back to you to give an explanation of that, because this generally is a work in progress now. The value of the contract is going to go up, but the contract is already awarded. So you can't go back out because this contract is already assigned. What happens then?
They don't need to come to the OPR for approval. Within their handbooks and guidelines and our general guidelines, there is provision as to how you deal with variation orders. And those would, based on their delegation of authority within the particular institute. For example, if you have delegation that needs to be taken straight up to the board level, the internal delegation of financial authority kicks in terms of approval. At the end, at the quarter, what we are requiring is that you report on the contract that was awarded, to whom it was awarded, the value of the contract, variation orders, and reason for variation orders. So you have to report for that on a quarterly basis. At the end of the year, you are also required to report against your annual procurement plan, and that report comes to the office in terms of how did you perform against what you said you were going to perform during the year in terms of your annual procurement plan. So we have two bites of the cherry. Once it comes on a quarterly basis, that report is rolled up and presented to the Speaker of the House, President of the Senate, in terms of the quarterly report. And the annual report, in terms of the performance against your annual report with these variation orders, is also presented to Parliament. But they don't have to seek our permission before, but they have to follow their delegation of authority and their handbooks and guidelines as approved by the OPR. So we approve those handbooks and guidelines. All handbooks and guidelines for the operation of the public bodies has to be approved by the office.
Chairman, just one last thing. Chairman, but then I will say a function such as the chief construction officer, to me, is in the line of fire. So I'm not saying based on experience that with respect to a variation, it's not something one that is substantial, because there will be some that are small, but some that are substantial. Maybe prior to even this, in terms of after the fact, I think when this thing is discovered, one should, out of an abundance of caution, flag it to the OPR to say this is coming, and so on. So we ensure everybody's on the same page, because this could create no end of difficulty, I believe, for the professionals within that activity.
I'll give you a very good point, member, and we will take it on board. I'll give you an example of something that happened in the last week of December. We got a report from one of our state agencies saying that we went out for a tender. The tender the terms of reference were understated. They went through the entire process. They realized that they understated it by a certain magnitude of, it was about $17,000. And they asked for our recommendation in terms of what do we do as best practice. And based on the information provided, we recommended that the best practice suggests that you go back out and retender the job, because it's something that was not done correctly in the first case.
That was wise, Chairman, but you're talking about 17,000. I'm telling you, sometimes it could be 17 million. You understand? You understand? And one could make the allegation that it was deliberately done to favor them. So I will say, in a case like that, when it is just work sometimes, that one should come to you before. And I think maybe that is something you should consider for your handbook, that depending on the value, that it is brought to your attention and flagged early, not wait until after the fact approach, because I think people could get into trouble with these things.
Yeah, we will take that on board. A good piece of advice, member. Thank you very much.
Welcome. Okay, Chairman. Yes, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman.
No problem. Chairman, Section 13(1) of the Act, the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act, allows the OPR on its own initiative via subsection N. So that will be subsection 13N, to investigate on its own initiative things that, or upon complaint from a member of the public, but things that may have come to their attention that they believe warrants some level of investigation or concern. Given the issues raised before, so this is outside of whistleblowing, but has the commission, has your committee at all engaged in any such initiative? Have you, on your own initiative as the OPR, looked at any situation involving any of these public entities and the expenditure of state funds, because you think that there may be a potential for corruption or something that was not appropriately done? Has the OPR engaged separately on its own initiative any any such investigation? And would you be in a position to share that with us, the findings, or would you prefer just to leave it as is if it is still ongoing?
The answer is no. We have not investigated or caused to be investigated because that part of the act is not proclaimed. What we have done is that we have started developing files with particular information. And once it falls within our jurisdiction, once the act is proclaimed, we have the information and in a number of files already ready to start those discussions.
Excellent. Any other questions from my colleagues? There be no indication of any such questions. Chairman and other members present, is there anything in addition that you would want to share with this committee, including maybe your concerns or your recommendations for how we can proceed thereafter to ensure that some of the serious issues that we have seen so far are addressed properly? I want to leave the chair open, this floor open to you, Mr. Chairman, and then to the PS.
Thank you very much. I must say thanks again to the chairman and the members of the committee. And as I normally close out these sessions when we have it with different agencies and so on, this act has given the country a really big gift. And if we had to make any significant change, we need to get this right. And we solicit the cooperation of everybody who will be looking on in the public domain. We have to actually give effect to this act to leave a legacy for our children and our grandchildren and the generations to come. Somebody has to say in the future that we did something right. And this is the opportunity to grasp it with both hands and make a big difference in our country for the future of this country and our generation. So thanks again very much. And I appeal to all members of the public, if you believe that you can assist us in any way, please don't hesitate, come forward.
Thank you, Chairman. Madam Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Finance, I open the floor to you for closing remarks.
Thank you, Chairman, for the opportunity. This has been a journey, a very effective journey. The Ministry of Finance has had a very fruitful relationship with the Office of Procurement Regulation, and in particular, the regulator from the very inception. It has been a partnership, and the office is, I must say, a very open and collaborative office. The regulator and all the staff are just a phone call away. We at the Ministry of Finance, we don't often say all that we do, but the Ministry of Finance has been working assiduously to facilitate all that has to be done to make this new procurement regime a reality within the prescripts of the Act. So thank you for the opportunity and thank you for your chairmanship, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. On behalf of the committee here, I want to thank you both organizations for being present here today, both the Ministry of Finance and the Office of Procurement Regulation, for your participation. We remain extremely concerned by the lack of buy-in by so many of these state bodies, so many of these government agencies, in terms of what the procurement regulator has been trying to do, the Office of the Procurement Regulation. I commend them on behalf of the committee. I think we all agree that a substantial amount of work has been done, but we look forward to substantial buy-in from maybe a little bit more aggression from the Ministry of Finance to ensure that the possibility and the risk of what we consider to be, as was raised previously, the risk of graft or corruption of an average figure of about $5.2 billion. That's a substantial amount of money. It is our hope that, I'm sure it is the national hope, that a lot more will be done very quickly to ensure that the regulations are in place and that the legislation is fully assented to and implemented. In that regard, I look forward to seeing both the Ministry of Finance and the the Office of the Procurement Regulation before us again. Hopefully at that point in time, we will be in a better frame of mind so that we'll have a readiness assessment checklist report that says 100% of the persons of the entities requested information from would have complied and would have been in full compliance with the regulations and the laws governing public procurement. Again, I thank you all very much. And on behalf of you all and the committee here, I want to thank members of the viewing audience for their presence. Thank you again. Have a good day, everyone. Be safe.
Thank you.